What happens when a wealthy heiress with an attitude dares to mock a judge who doesn't tolerate arrogance? What begins as a courtroom clash turns into a life-changing lesson no one saw coming. Stay with us as we unravel the gripping story of Whitney Lennox, a socialite who thought she was untouchable, until justice taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Before we jump into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy compelling stories that leave a lasting impact, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The courthouse was alive with movement that morning. People shuffled in and out, their hushed conversations filling the halls with a low hum of anticipation. Inside courtroom 3B, it wasn't just another day. Everyone knew that this hearing would be different. Today's case, the whispers went, is one to watch. At the center of the attention was Whitney Lennox, a woman whose name was synonymous with extravagance. A fixture in the tabloids, Whitney had built a reputation for throwing lavish parties, flaunting her wealth, and disregarding rules that others couldn't afford to break. She seemed untouchable. Until now. This wasn't her first run-in with the law, but it was certainly the most serious. Her reckless driving incident had endangered lives, and her string of unpaid fines only fueled the outrage. Yet, it wasn't the charges alone that drew the crowd. It was who she'd be facing. Judge Benson Leland entered the courtroom with the kind of quiet authority that silenced every whisper. Known for his sharp intellect and unyielding stance on accountability, Judge Leland was a man who had made a career out of ensuring justice prevailed, no matter the name or the fortune behind it. His reputation wasn't built on theatrics but on results. When Judge Leland presided, people listened and learned. As he took his seat, his eyes scanned the room briefly, pausing just long enough to land on Whitney, who had finally decided to grace the proceedings with her presence. Her arrival had been as grand as one would expect. Late, of course, and accompanied by the clacking of designer heels that echoed through the courtroom like an announcement of superiority. She wore oversized sunglasses that she only removed when seated, revealing an expression of indifference. Her demeanor didn't go unnoticed. Whispers among the crowd grew louder for a moment before Judge Leland's presence hushed them once more. The tension in the room was undeniable. This wasn't just another spoiled heiress facing a slap on the wrist. This was a confrontation between unchecked privilege and the kind of justice that refused to waver. Jacob, a seasoned attorney, had dealt with difficult clients before, but Whitney was a league of her own. "Whitney, please," he murmured, his tone pleading. "Let's keep things professional." She ignored him, pausing in the aisle to adjust her handbag. People waiting for her to move exchanged annoyed glances, but she remained oblivious. The journalist Emily Cho sat near the front, scribbling notes furiously. A rising star in investigative reporting, Emily was known for capturing courtroom drama with precision. Today, she was here to witness whether Judge Benson Leland's reputation for firm justice would hold up against Whitney's defiance. Emily's sharp eyes flicked between Whitney and the murmuring spectators, already sensing the tension in the air. Nearby, Officer Hughes, the courtroom bailiff, stood like a statue by the judge's bench. His no-nonsense demeanor hinted that he wouldn't hesitate to restore order if Whitney's antics crossed a line. He watched her with an expression that bordered on irritation, his presence a silent reminder of authority. As Whitney finally took her seat, she slid her sunglasses off with a dramatic flair, tossing them onto the table. She leaned back, crossing her legs and whispering something sarcastic to Jacob. Her dismissive attitude sent a ripple through the room. Some spectators exchanged knowing looks, whispering predictions about how long her arrogance would last in Judge Leland's courtroom. The tension in the room tightened as the side door opened. Judge Benson Leland entered, his black robes billowing slightly as he strode to the bench. A man of unshakable resolve, his very presence silenced the whispers. He placed his glasses on the desk, glanced briefly at the gallery and then at Whitney. His expression didn't change, but the way his gaze lingered for a moment seemed to command respect, or at least attention. "All rise," Officer Hughes announced. The room stood as one, save for Whitney, who hesitated before slowly getting to her feet, her sigh audible. Her display of irritation earned a sharp glance from her lawyer, but it didn't faze her. She wore an expression that screamed impatience. Judge Leland took his seat. "Be seated," he said, his deep voice cutting through the room with authority. As the crowd settled, the sense of anticipation grew. For a moment, all eyes were on Whitney, who leaned back in her chair, as though she were waiting for someone to entertain her. Judge Leland opened the file in front of him and adjusted his glasses. The room fell silent, every ear straining to catch his first words. The game, it seemed, was about to begin. The courtroom settled as Judge Benson Leland adjusted his glasses and opened the thick file before him. He began reading aloud the charges: reckless driving, unpaid parking fines, and a public altercation with a valet. His tone was steady and deliberate, each word cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Mrs. Lennox," he addressed, glancing up briefly, "you stand accused of reckless driving that endangered the lives of Clara Rivera and her young daughter Mia, as well as accumulating an alarming number of unpaid fines. There is also a report of a verbal altercation at a valet stand, during which property was damaged. Do you understand the charges against you?" Whitney, who had been examining her manicured nails, barely looked up. "I mean, sure," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "But it's not like I actually hit anyone. This is all being blown out of proportion." Her lawyer, Jacob Kane, visibly cringed. He leaned in, whispering urgently, but Whitney simply waved him off. A faint ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery as spectators exchanged incredulous glances. Whitney's lack of seriousness was almost as shocking as the charges themselves. Judge Leland maintained his composure, but his sharp eyes lingered on Whitney for a moment. He turned to the prosecution, signaling for them to proceed. The prosecutor called Clara Rivera to the stand. Clara, a modestly dressed woman in her 30s, walked up with a quiet dignity. She took her oath, her hands trembling slightly, and began recounting the day of the incident. Her voice faltered as she described the moment Whitney's car sped toward them, her daughter's terrified scream echoing in her ears. "I thought we were going to die," Clara said, her voice cracking. "I grabbed Mia and ran, but I twisted my ankle trying to get us out of the way. The car didn't stop. She just laughed and drove off." The courtroom was silent. Even the sound of the reporter's pen stopped as everyone absorbed Clara's words. Whitney, however, leaned over to Jacob and muttered, "She's being dramatic. I didn't even come that close." Her voice was loud enough to carry, and the crowd reacted with gasps of disbelief. Judge Leland paused, his gaze shifting to Whitney. "Mrs. Lennox," he said, his tone calm but firm, "you will refrain from speaking unless addressed. Do I make myself clear?" Whitney's expression soured, but she nodded, muttering under her breath. The tension in the room thickened as Clara continued her testimony, describing the ongoing fear her daughter experienced whenever they crossed a street. As Clara left the stand, the weight of her words hung in the air. Judge Leland closed the file before him and leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Whitney. "This is your final warning," he said. "You are expected to take these proceedings seriously. If you cannot, I will ensure you face the consequences of your actions." Whitney smirked, crossing her arms. "Fine, whatever," she said. The courtroom murmured again, and even her lawyer's patience seemed to be wearing thin. Judge Leland didn't respond immediately, but the way he picked up his pen and jotted something in his notes left the audience wondering what he had in store. The prosecution stood, requesting permission to present evidence. Judge Benson Leland nodded, gesturing toward the screen mounted on the wall. The lights dimmed slightly and the courtroom turned its attention to the video playback. The footage began with a view of a bustling city street. Cars moved cautiously, pedestrians crossed carefully, and then, suddenly, Whitney's luxury car sped into frame. The vehicle swerved dangerously close to Clara and her daughter Mia. Clara pulled Mia back just in time, stumbling in the process. The camera caught a clear view of Whitney in the driver's seat, laughing with a friend, seemingly unaware, or unconcerned, about the near disaster. The room fell silent, save for a few sharp intakes of breath. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even the journalist Emily Cho leaned forward, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Whitney's lawyer, Jacob Kane, buried his head in his hands, his frustration palpable. Whitney, however, sat back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression defiant. When the video ended, she leaned toward her lawyer and said, loud enough for all to hear, "That's it? That's what all the fuss is about?" The prosecutor turned to Judge Leland. "Your Honor, the footage speaks for itself." Judge Leland's gaze shifted to Whitney. His expression remained calm, but there was a perceptible weight in his silence. He glanced at Jacob. "Does the defense wish to respond?" Jacob hesitated, clearly struggling to formulate a defense, but before he could speak, Whitney cut him off. "This whole thing is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp. "That video is blown way out of proportion. I didn't hit anyone, and I wasn't even that close. Honestly, this is just an attack on me because I'm wealthy." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Whitney's words, dripping with entitlement, seemed to ignite the room. Judge Leland raised a hand and the noise subsided instantly. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench, leaning forward slightly. His calm exterior remained, but his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "Miss Lennox," he began, his voice steady, "what I see here is not just a lack of accountability, but a troubling dismissal of the gravity of your actions." Whitney rolled her eyes, but this time her defiance seemed forced, her confidence starting to waver. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Leland continued. "Privilege," he said, "is not a shield from responsibility. It is a burden that requires humility and awareness. Your actions endangered lives, and your words today reveal a complete lack of understanding or care about the consequences." The gallery sat in rapt silence, hanging on every word. The prosecutor nodded slightly, clearly satisfied with the judge's response, while Jacob shifted uncomfortably beside Whitney. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but Judge Leland held up a hand, silencing her. "This court is not here to punish you out of spite," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It is here to ensure that justice is served and that lessons are learned." The suspense in the room was electric. Judge Leland's tone suggested that the proceedings were building toward a pivotal moment, and every person present leaned forward, eager to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Mrs. Lennox," Judge Leland began, his voice even but resolute, "your actions reflect not only recklessness but a troubling lack of empathy for the lives of others. This court is tasked not just with penalizing wrongdoing, but with ensuring that lessons are learned." He paused, letting his words settle over the room like a weight. The gallery sat on edge, the air heavy with anticipation. "Therefore," he continued, "it is the decision of this court that you will complete 300 hours of community service at the Lincoln Youth Rehabilitation Center. There, you will work directly with young individuals whose lives have been upended by circumstances beyond their control. You will also attend mandatory empathy training sessions designed to help you understand the impact of your actions." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whitney's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of a crack in her composed facade. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering urgently, but Jacob Kane offered no reassurance. He simply sat still, his expression resigned. "This is the cause of depression." Judge Leland's tone shifted slightly, becoming sharper. "Additionally," he said, "you will write a public apology to be shared with the local press, addressing the victims of your reckless behavior, and to ensure you fully grasp the consequences of your actions, you will meet with families who have been directly impacted by reckless driving. You will listen to their stories and document your reflections, which will be submitted to this court." Whitney's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words came out. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Emily Cho scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes darting between Whitney and the judge. Even Officer Hughes, stoic as ever, shifted slightly, his attention fully locked on the unfolding drama. The judge allowed the noise to subside before continuing, his voice regaining its calm but authoritative tone. "This is not just about punishment, Ms. Lennox. It is about ensuring that you leave this courtroom with a deeper understanding of the value of accountability. Should you fail to comply with any aspect of this sentence, you will face far harsher consequences." The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Whitney shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her bravado now replaced by something closer to unease. She tried to appear indifferent, crossing her arms and leaning back, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. Clara Riviera, sitting quietly in the gallery, watched the scene unfold. When Judge Leland glanced her way, she gave a small nod, her expression calm and forgiving. It was a moment of quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to Whitney's earlier defiance. Judge Leland's eyes returned to Whitney. "Do you have any questions about the terms of your sentence?" he asked, his tone steady. Whitney hesitated for a moment before shaking her head, though her defiance flickered briefly in her gaze. The judge let the silence stretch before delivering his final words. "This court is adjourned," he said, striking his gavel with precision. As the room began to stir, Whitney sat frozen, the enormity of her sentence finally sinking in. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, filled with a mixture of approval and astonishment. Whitney's lawyer leaned in, whispering something to her, but she gave no response. Meanwhile, Clara stood and began to make her way out. She glanced at Whitney briefly, her face a mixture of compassion and quiet disappointment. It was a look that lingered, leaving an impression deeper than words ever could. Whitney Lennox arrived at the Lincoln Youth Rehabilitation Center with an air of disdain. Her luxury car pulled up to the modest building, standing out starkly against the worn brick exterior. She stepped out, designer sunglasses shielding her eyes, and glanced around as though she couldn't believe she was expected to set foot in such a place. Karen Mills, the center's director, was waiting by the entrance. A no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, Karen had seen plenty of privileged volunteers who thought they were above the work. She greeted Whitney with a curt nod, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lennox, welcome to Lincoln Youth," Karen said firmly. "We start at 8 a.m. sharp. You'll be helping in the classroom today." Whitney responded with a half-hearted smile and followed Karen inside. As they walked through the bustling halls, Whitney's discomfort was evident. The cheerful voices of the kids and teens seemed to irritate her, and she trailed behind Karen, barely concealing her annoyance. The first few days were a battle of wills. Karen quickly caught on to Whitney's attempts to feign involvement. She would sit at a desk scrolling through her phone, or pretend to help while barely engaging with the kids. When Karen confronted her, Whitney's response was dismissive. "Look, I'm here, aren't I?" Whitney said, arms crossed. "I don't see why I need to do more than that." Karen's stern gaze didn't falter. "If you think this is a box you can check off without putting in the effort, you're mistaken," she said. "These kids deserve better than that." Unmoved, Whitney attempted to bypass the process entirely. She called her lawyer, Jacob Kane, and asked him to negotiate a lesser sentence. "Can't you talk to the judge?" she demanded over the phone. "I'm wasting my time here." Unbeknownst to Whitney, Karen had overheard the conversation. The next day, Karen assigned Whitney to work directly with the teens instead of handling administrative tasks, knowing it would force her out of her comfort zone. One afternoon, while Whitney was reluctantly supervising a group activity, she overheard a boy named Jordan talking to another staff member. Jordan, a 16-year-old with a quiet demeanor, recounted the car accident that had changed his life. A reckless driver had struck his family's vehicle, leaving him with injuries that ended his dream of playing professional sports. The pain in his voice was impossible to ignore. For the first time, Whitney didn't have a snide remark or dismissive thought. She listened, unable to shake the connection between Jordan's story and the incident that had brought her here. She glanced at Jordan, who was helping another teen with a project, and something in her shifted. Meanwhile, Emily Cho, the journalist covering Whitney's court-ordered journey, had been quietly documenting her progress. Whitney found Emily's presence irritating at first, brushing off her attempts to ask questions. "Shouldn't you be writing about something more important?" Whitney had said dismissively. But the patient stayed rigid. But Emily persisted, observing without judgment. Over time, Whitney began to realize that Emily wasn't just there to expose her failures. Instead, Emily's questions often forced Whitney to reflect on her actions in a way she hadn't before. One day, after a long session at the center, Emily asked, "Do you think this experience is changing you, Whitney?" Whitney scoffed but hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted finally. It was the first moment of vulnerability she had shown since the trial. Though Whitney still resisted fully engaging, the cracks in her defenses were beginning to show. Her transformation was slow, but the seeds had been planted. The days at the Lincoln Youth Rehabilitation Center slowly began to reshape Whitney Lennox. What started as reluctant compliance turned into something she didn't expect, a genuine connection with the people around her. One afternoon, while assisting with a group project, Whitney noticed Jordan struggling with an assignment. She hesitated at first, unsure of how to approach him. Finally, she sat down beside him. "Need a hand?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Jordan looked up, surprised but grateful. As they worked together, Whitney found herself listening to his story in more detail. Jordan shared his struggles, not just with the physical pain from the accident, but with the emotional toll of losing his dreams. For the first time, Whitney didn't feel the need to dismiss or deflect. She just listened. That moment marked a shift. Whitney began arriving at the center earlier, staying later, and taking on more responsibilities. She helped organize activities, mentored the younger kids, and even started advocating for additional resources for the center. Karen Mills, who had been skeptical of Whitney's intentions, started to notice the change. "Looks like you're finally figuring it out," Karen remarked one evening. Whitney smiled faintly, realizing she no longer felt the need to prove herself. She just wanted to help. One day, after weeks of hesitation, Whitney decided to visit Clara Rivera. Standing outside Clara's modest home, she felt nervous for the first time in years. When Clara opened the door, her surprise was evident. "Ms. Lennox?" Clara said, her tone cautious. I just wanted to apologize," Whitney began, her voice steady but earnest. "Not just for what I did, but for how I acted in court. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Clara's expression softened. She invited Whitney inside, and the two talked for hours. Whitney listened as Clara described the fear she felt that day and the challenges of raising a daughter in a world that often felt unsafe. By the end of the visit, the tension between them had lifted, replaced by an unexpected mutual understanding. Whitney's journey didn't end there. At Karen's suggestion, she decided to write about her experience. What started as a personal reflection turned into a heartfelt open letter. In it, Whitney admitted her past mistakes, acknowledged her privilege, and shared the lessons she had learned at the youth center. The letter, published in a prominent local newspaper, quickly went viral. It sparked a wave of discussion about accountability, privilege, and the power of change. Comments flooded in, with readers expressing admiration for Whitney's honesty and growth. Emily Cho, who had been documenting Whitney's journey from the beginning, wrote a companion piece detailing the transformation she had witnessed. Her article painted a vivid picture of Whitney's struggles and redemption, reaching an even wider audience. For the first time, Whitney's name wasn't associated with scandal or entitlement. It was tied to a story of growth and change. Yet, Whitney knew her work wasn't finished. She had learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process. The familiar hum of the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt different this time. Whitney Lennox walked through the hallways, her steps measured and deliberate. She wasn't accompanied by flashy sunglasses or designer labels. Instead, she wore a simple outfit, blending into the crowd. The confidence she once wore as a shield was no longer a mask of arrogance. It now carried the quiet strength of someone who had learned humility. As she entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the spectators. Those who had attended her initial hearing barely recognized her. The defiant socialite who had treated the proceedings like an inconvenience was gone, replaced by a woman who carried the weight of her journey with grace. Judge Benson Leland sat at the bench, his sharp gaze steady as Whitney approached. She stood before him, her posture respectful, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mrs. Lennox," Judge Leland began, his voice resonating through the room, "you are here today to report on the completion of your sentence. Do you have anything you wish to say before we proceed?" Whitney nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her tone steady but filled with emotion. "When I first stood in this courtroom, I didn't understand the consequences of my actions. I didn't care how they affected others. Over the past months, I've learned what it means to take responsibility, not just for what I did, but for the kind of person I was. I'm truly sorry for the harm I caused, and I'm grateful for the chance to make amends." The gallery sat in silence, captivated by her sincerity. Even Clara Rivera, seated in the front row, seemed moved. Her expression softened as she watched Whitney speak. Judge Leland leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze unyielding. "Mrs. Lennox, it is not often that I see someone return to this courtroom with such a transformation. Your progress speaks volumes, not just about the value of accountability, but about the potential for change when one is willing to confront their flaws." The judge paused, allowing his words to resonate. "However," he continued, "growth is not a destination. It is a journey that requires ongoing effort and reflection. What you have done so far is commendable, but it is only the beginning. The true test lies in how you carry these lessons forward." As Judge Leland finished speaking, a ripple of applause spread through the courtroom. Clara stood, her hands clasped together in quiet approval, and soon others followed. The moment felt charged with a sense of resolution and hope. Whitney turned briefly to the gallery, her eyes meeting Clara's. There was no need for words. The exchange spoke volumes. For the first time, Whitney felt a sense of peace, not because her sentence was over, but because she had earned something far more valuable: respect. Judge Leland struck the gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned," he said, his voice firm yet almost approving. As Whitney left the courtroom, the sun outside seemed brighter. The reporters waiting by the steps were still there, but this time Whitney didn't flinch. She paused, looked directly into the cameras and said, "I'm not the person I was before. I'm still learning, and I hope my story encourages others to do the same." The cameras clicked furiously, but Whitney didn't linger. Her focus was no longer on what people thought of her, it was on the journey ahead. As the courtroom emptied and the buzz of the hearing faded, the story of Whitney Lennox remained fresh in everyone's minds. What had started as a collision between unchecked privilege and firm justice had become something far greater, a tale of transformation, redemption, and the power of accountability. Privilege can blind us to the consequences of our actions, making us believe we are untouchable. But true growth comes when we face those consequences head-on and choose to change. Whitney Lennox learned this lesson the hard way. The question is, would you? What would you do if faced with the same opportunity for redemption? Change is hard, but it is possible if we're willing to embrace it. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation, justice, and hope. Together, let's keep learning and growing.